Philanthropy New York is attempting to do is to provide a venue for shared learning on a topic which many of us see in very different ways. I said this before, but I think it's worth repeating. When asked why people see the same issue in so many different and opposing ways, Michelle Fine said, "We form our opinions based on our own biographies, yearning, and secret desires. To build shared understanding, organizations must create conditions in which people open their minds." We are here today to create together a public space or a commons for learning and dialogue. This commons, or at least the effort to build it, is something Ford supports everywhere we work. And we are very pleased to be part of this today. Working together is a universal concept. In the Middle East, they say, in the desert of life, the wise person travels by caravan, while the fool prefers to travel alone. In Africa, they say, if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. The only ground rule today that I might offer, my friend David Steiner, who's facilitating the conversation, might ask you to follow some additional rules, is to embrace this concept of a public space where we can respectfully engage in dialogue with deep respect for each other. Again, I think we should thank Ronna, Michael, and especially Susan, our leaders at Philanthropy New York, for pursuing this very ambitious and exciting goal. And now I'll turn it over to Ronna Brown. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred, for that incredibly generous introduction and that very apt setup for what we are trying to do today. What Fred did not say is that he is actually the one who posed the question to his colleagues about a year and a half ago, which is how could we all come together in a way to help a new administration in New York City? Everyone thought about it, had much conversation, and the answer to that question that he posed was this project. And I have slides, so I can show you all who those folks were. All of these people on this list, and many more, have contributed more than $2 billion to New York City education over the last decade. When you think about that investment, and you think about the goal that the city has held up, that every student graduate ready for college or career, it is clear that we need to know what works and how we can build on what works. That was the theme for our project. We decided the way that we could be the most useful was to go to 3 outstanding institutions and a fabulous group of academics and ask them to write 3 different papers, each of which will be analyzing what's happened and lead us to this 3rd paper that we're releasing today with 6 priorities for a new administration. To ensure that those papers were as thoughtful and representative as possible, we asked an incredible group of academics and practitioners to read, comment, and provide their support to the work that those 3 sets of academics were doing. Here is the list of our advisors, some of whom are with us today, and our thanks to each of them. In releasing our 3rd paper today, we will be laying out 6 priorities for the next administration. We ask that they consider those. In a few minutes, Shawn Morehead, Program Officer, Education and Human Justice at the New York Community Trust, will be walking you through those 6 priorities which underlie the discussion that David Steiner will be moderating. Before Shawn comes up to do that, however, it is my distinct pleasure and honor to be able to introduce Dr. Merryl Tisch, Chancellor of the New York Board of Regents. She's here to share some comments today about the task that we have set for ourselves. In addition to being the Chancellor and being on a number of boards, Dr. Tisch has a very deep background in education and in philanthropy, and that makes her really the perfect person to start us off this morning. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Tisch. Oops. Thank you.
So, first of all, it's wonderful to be in this room and to see so many friends. I would be remiss if I didn't point out former Commissioner David Steiner, Commissioner of Education, who, along with his then deputy, wrote, I think, the most brilliant dissertation for public education transformation that brought to New York State $700 million, without which, quite frankly, we would not be sitting here talking about the possibilities of the next administration. David Steiner, you're a gentleman, a scholar, and a brilliant education leader. So as many of you in this room know, Commissioner King and I and the Board of Regents have been around this state for the past 3 weeks, listening to comments from parents and teachers and superintendents and school administrators on the subject of Common Core. And what we hear are basically, well, we're all for Common Core. We believe in Common Core. And then we get the buts. And the buts are a variety of things that are actually strategically important in communities around the state and need to be addressed. But ladies and gentlemen, they have not presented a case for moving away from Common Core. And let me tell you why I think Common Core is very important. In New York City, which is where we find ourselves, when students graduate from high school, 75% of them need to be remediated at two-year colleges. Let me translate that for you. As taxpayers, that means that you are paying college tuition for high school content. That is simply not sustainable. Additionally, what you need to know is after 6 years in a two-year community college program, the graduation rates in our two-year community colleges in New York City is somewhere between 24 and 25%. This is not sustainable. Another fact that you need to know is that employers come to us on a perpetual basis saying to us, Merryl, we would love to open a plant here or open a plant here. We have hundreds of thousands of jobs that we can bring to New York State. The problem is the kids you're sending us are simply not college and career ready. They do not have the skills that translate into their ability to hold and sustain employment in our factories, in our workplaces. It's a very significant problem for New York State. It's a significant problem for the country. So I want to just lay out for you what I see when I travel the state. It may be very different than what you're reading about, because I go into classrooms and I go into communities and I see growth of potential. I see hard work being done. I see principals, teachers, parents talking about instruction and curriculum. Yes, they are also talking about testing, but as David always said to me, Merryl, what we need to do is change the paradigm. Instead of having testing drive curriculum and instruction, David, we need to have curriculum and instruction drive testing. One thing about David, he's a great professor and I'm a pretty good student. We cannot have the implementation of Common Core that is isolated from an accountability system. Now, it is true that the rollout of Common Core across this state has not been even, but there are districts, and there are many districts, where the implementation of Common Core has taken root and taken seed, that parents and principals and superintendents and communities are coming together around a higher standard. The challenges are deep. For New York City right now, we are going through a transformation. We are changing from one administration into the next. And I am here today just to lay out before you a couple of ideas that I think the next administration should really focus on. Number one, the financial commitment that the Bloomberg administration made to its school system, I think, is extraordinary. The city alone puts in $24 billion a year into its public school system. The fund for the public school system, and I see its leader here, have been remarkable in focusing targeted dollars to the school system. And I would like to see the funding for the system continue. I'd like to see it grow. I'd like to see the city continue to put a large chunk of change on the table, but I'd like to see it be purposeful. I'd like to see it be driven to those core principles that we all know need to take seed. Number one, and I think the mayor-elect has spoken very passionately about this, our need to give pre-K the true ability to be a universal pre-K program in the city of New York. I think that that is tantamount to really setting up the reform in ways that will really move us forward. I also think, and I know this is a very complicated issue, but all of these issues are complicated. I also think that we've got to really find a way to carve out a path so that our teachers and our city leaders have a fruitful conversation. Much has been made of the acrimony between the teachers' union and the current administration. I would urge everyone to remember that the current administration gave the teachers the greatest pay raise in the history of the city. That is not a little deal. However, complications arise, temperaments take over. I think it is time to put the acrimony between teachers and the administration to bed. We cannot run a public school system that will be beneficial to our citizens, to our future as a city, to our future as a state, if the acrimony with the union continues. And so I would urge an early settlement of the contract. I would urge an open, very important dialogue, and it's time to move forward. I also think there are many programmatic opportunities that will come forward as a way of implementing Common Core. And I'd like to talk about three of them. During these past few years, it has been clear to us that New York State is at the heart of the reform. But you cannot really reform a system unless you identify the possibility for choice for young adults as they move forward. And we are going to be putting forth a program called Multiple Pathways to Graduation. Right now in New York State, there are 5 Regents exams that are exit exams. Everyone has to take them. It's a math, an English, and a science. And those 3, by the way, are mandated by the federal government. Then there are 2 others. There's a history and a global history. I would submit to you that we have the opportunity to create a pathway here so that schools and school districts can choose to invest in career and technical programs. They can choose to invest in math and science programs. They can choose to invest in art, music, and theater. Let's promote scholars who are young artists. Let's promote scholars who are young career and technical scholars. Let's promote scholars, quite frankly, who will lead the next STEM generation into the greatness that we all know will unleash enormous economic capacity for our citizens. I'd also like to talk about the ability to continue the choice. I see Garth here. It should not be lost on any of you that that young man created the choice program in New York City. He went about and he really carved a pathway for students across this city to have a choice about where they want to go to school. Now, Garth, I'm sure, will be the first one to tell you it was a very complicated drill, and I'm sure he will be the first one to tell you that it is not perfect. Choice is only choice if every student in the system has a choice. And I would urge the next administration to continue on with choice, but to understand that at the heart of communities has to be a school. Schools are those drivers for community participation that bring everyone together. I would also urge the next administration, as we think about professional development around Common Core, We simply cannot leave out parents. I go from community to community around the state, and all I hear from parents is, Merrill, I can't help my child with their 4th and 5th grade math homework. It's different. It looks different. I think along with professional development, we have to invest critical dollars in preparing parents to help their students. You cannot succeed in a school system if you leave the parents on the sideline. And before I leave this stage and let you go on with your really important work, I want to make a final comment about the networks. When Michael Bloomberg took over the school administration in this city, and I see Shael here. Hi, Shael. They set in place fixing a bureaucracy that was shameful, a bureaucracy that served no one, certainly didn't serve children, certainly didn't serve parents, certainly didn't serve communities. And they went about fixing a very large system. And along that way, they tried a few different models, finally ending up with the network model. I believe the network model has some sustainability in it, but I would urge the networks to be rethought in a way that includes students with special needs, differentiated learning styles, and includes students that, quite frankly, need support around language acquisition. It is not reform if you leave 35% of your students out. So, here we are. You have very important listening to do today. I would just urge all of you to stand up for the Common Core, to stand up for the work, and to know that the challenges are great, but the rewards will be even greater. Thank you so much, and good luck to all of you.
So I confess that I'm 41 and I usually feel very old, but today I'm feeling like the baby that some people occasionally refer to me as, because I'm in a room of very thoughtful, esteemed, and experienced colleagues. So I'm the messenger today, but I want to start out by thanking Merryl, thanking the panelists, and thanking my colleagues who worked with us on the Education Funders Research Initiative. I would name you all, but since I am actually old and not a baby, I would definitely forget someone. So thank you all so much. It has been a tremendous pleasure. I also have to thank Ronna and Michael and Susan Kahn from Philanthropy New York, who frankly did all of the real work to make this happen, except for the three groups that I'm going to name now. Those are Leslie Siskin from NYU, Tom Hatch and Doug Reddy from Columbia, and Andrew, Kim, Clara, and Tom, who have last names, from the New School, who not all of those groups did an outstanding job doing great research for this project, and we're really appreciative. I also want you to know that the folks at the New School and the Center for New York City Affairs did a tremendous amount of work with the funders, and what we're presenting to you today are some agreed upon priorities, and they were privy to and helped us along when there wasn't widespread agreement. So thank you so much for all of your work on that. Now, with the input from these tremendous researchers, we learned or were reminded of some important things. We learned that more than 90% of students who were proficient in reading in 3rd grade went on to graduate on time from high school. We also learned that 80% of students who passed an AP course in high school also went on to complete at least a year of college. We also learned that data and accountability tools can be tremendously valuable for setting benchmarks and motivating school leaders. Now, I'm also going to give you the caveat that the researchers have done a much more thorough and nuanced job than I have done, so please go read what they wrote. But those were 3 pieces of very positive news that came out of the research. And part of what we want to encourage is to build upon that positive news, learn from what we're seeing that's working, and have a conversation about where we should go next. And so from these points and the many other findings in the 3 papers, a set of 6 priorities emerged. Priorities that a group of diverse funders in the project were able to agree on, and that build on what is working to address the continuing and, frankly, limitless need to continue to make our public schools better for the kids who live in our city. So the first of the priorities is around literacy. And I'm waiting to see if it will come up on the screen. Yeah. I'm supposed to put it up on the screen. God, that's embarrassing. And I was apparently supposed to show you all of these other slides too. So the first priority is around literacy. And the funders have agreed, based on the research, to set a priority of taking action to dramatically improve literacy in the early grades, so more students are prepared for high school. This should include intensive interventions for struggling readers, as well as expanded early education, full-day pre-kindergarten, and targeted investments in community-based supports for low-income families and Black and Latino students who have the lowest rates of academic success and reading proficiency. The second priority, which also focuses on what we're working with schools to do for students, is around the Common Core. And to use the newly adopted Common Core standards to promote college readiness by investing greater attention and resources into the teaching of reading, writing, research, analysis, problem solving, and other academic behaviors, as well as social and emotional skills, to prepare students for rigorous coursework before they graduate. And the third is college and career planning, to concentrate more resources, either directly or through partnerships with community-based organizations, in early and ongoing support for college and career guidance, especially for the majority of young people who don't have this support in their own families. These first 3 priorities really build on what we saw as promoting success for students in the city schools, bringing rigor in the early grades to make sure that students are successfully becoming really great readers so that they can continue to succeed in the later grades, building course rigor in the later years in high school so that we're preparing students to succeed and persist in college, and then making sure that students have college knowledge. The next 3 priorities focus on what we can do as a system to help students get where we want them to be. Accountability. Ensure a strong accountability system that uses a wider range of performance measures, making it more informative for and responsive to the needs of school leaders, school staff, and families. School leadership. Retain principals' important ability to control hiring, budgets, and curriculum, but establish a clear chain of command that provides supervision and also appropriate support by superintendents and/or network leaders. And finally, systemic support. Strengthen traditional zoned neighborhood schools and develop structures to connect all schools, neighborhood, magnet, and charters alike, within given geographic areas or networks. Now, our goal with these priorities was not to dictate, although we funders do sometimes have a tendency to tell people what we think they ought to do, but rather to start a robust conversation around a set of priorities that represent common ground for a diverse group of funders. And so now, to manage that conversation today, I am going to turn the mic over to David Steiner, Before I tell you who he is, for those of you who may not know, I also want to remind everyone that you got index cards when you walked in today, and that you should write questions that you have for the panel on those index cards and pass them to the end, and then that's how we'll present questions for David to ask of the panelists. So from there, I turn it over to David Steiner, who is the Clara and Larry Silverstein Professor of Dean at the Hunter School of Education and the Director of the CUNY Institute for Education Policy. And of course, as we've already heard, he's our former Commissioner for Education here in the state of New York.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chancellor Tisch, everyone. I'd like the panelists to join on the stage, if they would. So thank you, Susan. Thank you, Ronna. Thank you for all the scholarship that lies behind today. I'm going to get straight into the questions because you know who these people are. The bios are in front of you. Garth is running New Haven. Pedro is running all sorts of projects around the city of New York. Ocynthia really knows more about the parents of this city than almost anyone I know, and everything else belongs to Shael. The first question I want to pose, in no particular order, is this. As you react to these priorities, as you think about them, what's not there and what would you have pushed harder on? What's not there and what would you have pushed harder on in the context of the years of reform that lie behind us and the challenges ahead? Maybe we'll start with Shael.
First of all, I think that the authors of this report should be congratulated. I think it's really a deep look at what's been happening over the past 12 years in New York City and a really thoughtful engagement across a wide sector of voices that brought together these proposals. And I don't agree with all of them, but I do think it's a really well worth reading for anyone who hasn't yet engaged it fully. I think the point that's made around literacy is critically important, and I agree fully with the argument that we need to invest more deeply at the early childhood level. And there's some mention also in the report at the middle school level. I think we can't actually focus at any one level at this moment in the history of the development of our system. We have to have that literacy focus happen at elementary, middle, and at high school. And I think it flows in different ways through the recommendations, but it's not possible given where our kids currently are. And I think one element of the report notes that one school had 50% of their kids who weren't readers as they came in at the high school level. And I think that work has to become, even a greater source of investment in our work ahead. The other thing, when we look at the curriculum and the shift to the Common Core, we talk a lot about the standards and we talk about the assessments. There has not yet been a real conversation about what's it going to take to shift 75,000 teachers' instructional practice. And that's the heart of what we've been engaged in over the past 2 years. And anyone who thinks that that's a 2-year project or a 3-year project is misguided. It's a deep capacity building effort, and there has to be time built into the fabric of school days if that's going to happen.
Great. Pedro.
Well, good morning, and I want to just thank Shael for saying the last part there, because I think that people have framed this as either you're for the Common Core or against the Common Core, and they've missed the point entirely. Implementation is the key. Raising the standards was the easy part, right? And as Shael pointed out, the capacity building work, and I would say specifically for schools serving large numbers of English language learners, has not been addressed. And it's a disturbing part of what's going on in New York City, because this is one of the most vulnerable populations and a very large population in the city. And we don't have good support systems for schools serving this population. The choice system has exacerbated this problem because we've concentrated the neediest children in the failing schools. And the only remedy we've had is to close them. This is not a strategy for capacity building. And we've seen a shell game where I mean, I've heard principals say, I'm worried because if they close that school, I'm getting those kids, and I'll be next. This is not a strategy for improvement. And so we have to, how do we maintain some degree of accountability, particularly transparency on how well schools are doing? But how do we consciously and deliberately build capacity in our poorest neighborhoods where we know failure rates have been highest? We need to think about how city government works with schools under mayoral control and with nonprofits and philanthropies to bring strategic support into schools. The community school model works, but it can't be left to principals by themselves to do that work. We need a higher level of cooperation, much more strategic approach to get some traction on improving schools in the communities that have suffered the most, I think, over the last 12 years.
So I guess two sets of initial framing comments. One, I'm struck. So the recommendations are heavily policy focused, and I feel in them an orientation to the student at the center, the literacy, their college preparation. A real attention to that, and I think that's good. I think that's healthy. I would say I think it's important not to misunderstand the ways in which some of the changes of the last administration actually influenced the instructional core, if you want to call it that. The small school work, some folks think of as structural. It was actually deeply instructional about the Common Core, using structure to influence that. That's probably worth further conversation and further discussion. I'd say, importantly in the work, for those of us that do it, that this is a policy set. I agree with Pedro, implementation is everything. Implementation is everything. And that you see it in the small school work that we did here. It was successful in New York, it was not successful in many other places, and that was because of the orientation on implementation. I'd say tone is important. That's one of the things. Tone, vision, inspiration of stakeholders is an important piece. It's one of the things that I've really learned and tried to develop in my work in New Haven. A couple things that I didn't see in the recommendations that I was surprised were missing. One was an orientation to innovation, right? And innovation in the classroom and at the instructional core, and the ways that we may need to change the fundamental production function or learning environment, however you want to describe it. I would also say, and something that's of increasing interest to me, very few references to students and student voice, right? The parents are referenced obliquely. I am increasingly interested in how do we engage students directly in these own challenges of their own learning, right? Talk to any student, they will tell you they know more than we think we do. And I think as a group, about both on their academic and their personal development, it's something that I think is a challenge for all of us in education.
Good morning. So I think that all of the 6 priorities that you have here is our group, my parent group will agree with most of it that's here. But I think that what should have been highlighted more would be like restorative justice programs. I didn't see really anything about the high rate of suspension that's going on. And if we think that any of this programming or these 6 priorities can be implemented and good programming put it into the schools, if the kids are not in the class to receive them, then we're going to be failing still. So I think that more restorative justice programming, deeper parent engagement at all levels should be a part of any new direction that the administration is going in. And I'm, looking at his transition team, I pretty much think that they understand exactly what needs to happen as we move forward. But and I think that this whole literacy thing is great, and I think that it has to start at a very early age. And then there are programs that are happening across the country now where schools, especially in my neighborhood, we are all trying to come together as a cluster of schools and look at what really needs to happen from pre-K to like 2nd grade so that kids will be prepared to be on task or on target by the time they're in 3rd grade. And I think my organization, the Coalition for Educational Justice, we think the Common Core is the way to go to, but the way it was implemented in this city and in the whole New York State was not the way to go, not the way to be implemented. And we agree with the whole college and career planning thing. We have a whole platform for college-ready community schools. And we think that it should be community schools in our neighborhoods to have quality schools, strong neighborhoods, and bright futures. The accountability, I think we really need to, when I think about accountability, right, the way that it was implemented here lately with the schools, with the whole high stakes testing, and then there was no accountability to me at Central. The accountability was pushed on principals, was pushed on students and teachers and parents, but I think that going forward, the accountability has to start from the Central. And the whole systemic support, I truly believe in the strengthening of traditional zone neighborhood schools. I mean, I hear when people say choice, they talk about choice, and to me, choice means charter schools. That's what people refer to as choice. And I think that if the schools in our neighborhoods and communities where I come from, if they are strengthened, if they are made to be better, then parents would have a better choice of sending their kids to the neighborhood school. They would feel safe. They could be more engaged, because when kids go all across the city to different schools, and I don't think that that's a bad thing, but it really then has an impact on parental engagement, okay, especially. I'm going on and on. I'm sorry, I'm going on and on. I just have a lot to say about all of this stuff.
I promise. Let me pull a few strands together in a context in something that Shael actually addressed at our institute a couple of nights ago. We have a strange paradox, perhaps, in this city. On every index, more or less, the results in the last decade have shot up. There are fewer dropouts. There are far more students graduating from high school on tougher standards, because what the Chancellor and the board have done, as many of you know, is to phase out the local diploma, the 55. So not only have those numbers gone up, they've gone up against tougher standards. On almost any research report you read, you see correctly the sentences, the system is much, much better. And yet at the same time, you don't see a majority of parents celebrating the system. That is a very deep paradox, and it goes to the heart of what the next administration will face. In the context of these recommendations, but against the backdrop of that paradox, how do we think about speaking to the next administration about how to move forward effectively? The policies seem to have had powerful impact, but the people haven't bought in. Who would like to start? It's a simple question.
Well, I would start. I think that those who are satisfied and happy are pretty quietly happy for the most part until they feel threatened.
Yeah.
Those who are not happy, and I think Ocynthia spoke to this, whose kids are floundering in schools that haven't received support, and I think you got to change the narrative. The narrative should be, we made progress, but we have a long way to go. That's what we never heard, I think, from the mayor. Right. Honest communication about the ongoing challenges, the ongoing work that needs to be done. I think Ocynthia is absolutely right. We never defined what accountability at the mayoral level looks like, or the chancellor's level. I kept asking, what are you accountable for to Joel Klein? And he could never really answer the question, except for holding others accountable. And I think that we have to really think through, how do we build that systemic support? The networks that have been raised already by the Chancellor, I think, Chancellor Tisch, that is an area we have to look at. If you have this many schools that are floundering, and there are literally hundreds of schools where kids are not even 30% at proficiency, then we've got to figure out, is that system going to work, or do we need to do something different? And what would it look like? I think that choice, what worries me now is seeing this city get bogged down in a fight about charter schools.
Yes.
I think that charters have shown, in many cases, real innovation. What hasn't happened is we haven't made it possible for schools to learn from each other. And I think that that's one of the things that the next administration needs to do. How do we learn from the public and charter schools? We have the international schools and other models that are very successful, so that those practices are influencing what's going on in other schools.
Garth, you've instituted a very strong accountability system. Have you brought the citizens of New Haven with you, and if so, how or to what extent?
You know, I would say a yes, I think to a significant degree, but a long way to go. So, I mean, I think a couple points to pick up on. I mean, one is, and I haven't looked at the climate survey data recently. I'm actually not sure that I know it's the case in New Haven, right, that most parents are actually satisfied with their individual school, right? And in circumstances where perhaps they shouldn't be, right? And I think that's an immense challenge for all of us to own. I think, when Pedro said we've come a long way and we have a long way to go, this has been part of the transition that I have done over the last 4 years, going to work with a long-term superintendent. One reason I went to New Haven, this was a superintendent mayor who owned everything about the system, but were deciding they wanted to reform it. Right? And so some of this is about rhetoric and how we talk about these things, right? And being able to say, yes, we've made progress, let's celebrate that progress, and let's not and then let's recognize all the distance we have to go. I would say that clearly about the new small school work, as Chancellor Tisch alludes. And I think in that, as a key for me, at least that I have found, is this, we have James Comer, Dr. Comer in New Haven, who launches the idea of no-fault problem solving, right? One of the things that I would say characterizes the education debate in New York, as I've moved away from it, is a fixation on fault. On all sides, let's be clear, on all sides. And part of the reason why we were able to do a teacher evaluation system that incorporated student learning very early in my tenure was recognizing this wasn't a question of fault and gotcha around teachers. What we were trying to build was a developmental system that took into account teachers' intrinsic motivations to have students learn. Right? So it's a rhetorical shift, but I think a really important rhetorical shift, and this I think is the framing challenge in school reform, is to figure out how to balance urgency, which is incredibly important, with sustainability and collaboration among stakeholders, which, as Fred said at the start, we're going to go much further if we go this journey together.
Well, one example that Ocynthia and I worked on recently around this type of collaboration, which I'm proud of, is Ocynthia and her colleagues brought to us a proposal that was a research-based proposal on how do we engage with parents around these new test scores. And she can tell you how many people were coming to her and her group, the Coalition for Educational Justice, complaining about, my kids dropped, I don't understand why, I don't know what their next step is. And they pushed us very hard to think about how can we build in more time for teachers and parents to talk to each other. And not just talk about the test scores, but talk about what is it that's happening for my child this year now? Where are their next steps? And that was not an easy thing to figure out how to do in the middle of September after the budgets were all allocated. It required collaboration from the teachers union and the principals union. And we did come together to do that and showed that it is possible to form that kind of collaboration and do something powerful, and it's happening. And I think that that's a good model for what we need moving forward. And I also think it's really important as we look back. Some of the things that you've said, Pedro, are partially true, but you're also missing the other half of the story. It's not accurate to say that the only school improvement strategy is closing schools. There's a really robust and intense set of work that networks have been doing over the past couple of years, specifically in the most struggling schools, and we've seen those schools improve. Of the DNF schools that got targeted action plans over the past 2 years, 75% of those schools have improved. 40% have improved by more than 2-letter grades. And that's through working on leadership, it's through working on curriculum, it's through working on thinking about how to use the money differently, it's thinking about how to build stronger CBO partnerships, and it's specific to each school environment. And I don't think there always has to be such a strong dichotomy. I think it's possible to say that in some schools it's not working and you need a new team of educators to try something different. And in other schools it can work and you can build capacity, and if you bring the right smart resources to the table, you can get real changes. And I think both are actually present in the current system, and there's exemplars that we can learn from on both fronts.
Cynthia, you want to comment on the work that you're doing with?
Yes. When we approached the DOE and Shael, like you said, it was around the huge drop in the test scores, but it wasn't centered on just the test scores. It really was about understanding that when parents and teachers are in collaboration, when they're working together, to make sure that their kid is, getting academic success, that is the best way to go. This was an opportunity, we felt, to really bring all of the partners together, all of us together, to look at what we could do, not just use these parent-teacher conferences to talk about the test scores, but to, yes, look at the child's history overall. If it wasn't the classroom teacher, some teacher who has this child during the course of the day. And we just felt that it would be just another model for the parents and teachers to come together as partners. And because as all of the other research shows, that when schools and families work together, kids do better academically. And again, this was just an opportunity.
Great.
To push that.
Thank you. You see Common Core up there, and the Chancellor spoke eloquently of it a few moments ago. One of the challenges the report speaks about is the fragmentation of the curriculum. As students move from elementary to middle to high, different approaches, different academics, they get 3 completely different ways of learning. This city and the state, through some of the Race to the Top funding, have endorsed certain curriculum packages, but there are several of them. How do we think about the Common Core and the curriculum that's going to support it citywide for the real experience of children who are going to be moving schools?
So first of all, we never have had an English curriculum in New York City. Let's be clear about that. Until this past year, there has not been an English curriculum. There was a set of instructional practices that were introduced in 2003 called balanced literacy that included the use of classroom libraries and a set of approaches to that, and schools evolved curricula from that. But the notion of a set of structured lessons organized around the range of skills that kids were coming to the table with, and a set of interventions to go with them, that has not existed. And so for the first time with the introduction of Common Core last spring, we really worked hard together with the state to identify 2 options at each grade level, both in English and in math, that could be used as curricula. And the jury's out. We're still in the 3rd month of implementing these curricula, and some teachers are seeing really positive stuff. Others are struggling to adapt it and fit it to the needs of their kids. And there's a tremendous amount of professional development that we're doing now. We started last year and continued over the summer and are continuing this year. But curriculum's not something that you can get in a box, open it up, and press go. Like, you actually have to learn how to use it in a meaningful way, and it means changing your practice. I was in a school up in the Bronx watching some math classes last week, and the kids were asking each other questions, not, what answer did you get on number 4, but how did you get to that answer? And they were doing the kind of responsive discussion and critical thinking that, if we're really going to get kids college ready, needs to be woven in at every level of the system. That's a direct result of this new curriculum, a direct result of the expectation that we're asking of teachers to push kids to do this cognitively challenging work, and it's exciting. And it's at the very beginning stages. And we're going to need several more years of deep investment to see it through. In Massachusetts, they started similar work in the mid-90s. 10 years later, they had real results. They were able to say, we're the strongest state in the country on the national assessment. And now they're competitive with Singapore and South Korea. That took several different administrations deciding not to back down, not to say this is too hard, engaging in concerted investments in professional development and capacity building, and really seeing it through year after year after year to get a very different kind of result.
Anyone else on that one?
Yeah, I would say, I agree with much of what Shael said. I actually think the Common Core recommendation, I think it misunderstands some of the most important pieces. I agree with what Shael, to underscore what Shael said earlier, I think the most important part of the Common Core is the instructional shift, and the instruction that allows that kind of critical thinking that Shael is talking about. And our curriculum has to allow for that space, but it's deeply an instructional practice question. To reinforce that, when I decided as someone without an education background that I could pursue this path, was actually sitting in the basement of Tweed with one of David Steiner's predecessors, hearing him say, predecessors as head honcho as commissioner, head honcho in state, saying, it's not appropriate to let high school teachers teach what they want to teach, because if we do that, they'll just teach an entire course on the Civil War. Right? And we have to understand that's been the conception of standards and curriculum to this point. And I sat in that room and I said, that I may not have many years in the classroom. That is deeply wrong for us to think that way. In my time in New York, I did some collaborative teaching with a teacher in a school in the Bronx, earth sciences, and I experienced it teaching with him. The breadth of coverage that we had to get to completely getting in the way of our ability to go deep with students on these exciting topics that we were talking about. So I think that we have to understand the Common Core that way. The other thing I would say that's embedded in this recommendation, which I would actually call out and make a different recommendation, is an emphasis on what I'm describing increasingly as personal development, right? Non-academic learning that students do in their time with us, which I think we have to understand is just as important as the academic learning. And again, there's collective responsibility about that. That's a game changer for many teachers, as Shael alludes earlier, to think differently, understand that their job is not just to communicate content, but actually to have students think about content, first order shift. Second order shift, to really think about student development around character, emotional intelligence, executive functioning, whatever you want to call it, that is a precursor to college, career, and life success.
Anyone else on this one?
Yeah, I just want to, I think since Shael raised Massachusetts, it's important to look at what happened in Massachusetts. I was there when it happened. The first year they implemented their high-stakes exams, 6,000 kids were denied diplomas. Who were those kids? 1/3 special ed kids, 1/3 English language learners. The other third, in the schools they knew, were not preparing the kids. It is unjust to assess children on an exam, using an exam that they've never been prepared for. It's just wrong. Massachusetts did learn from that mistake and got better, but if you listen to Paul Revelle, who was commissioner for much of that period, he acknowledges that they didn't do the work in Springfield and Holyoke and other high poverty areas that continue to have high failure. So I think we should look to Massachusetts because they are doing many things right, and one of the things they're doing right is being honest about the journey. In New York City, what I would say is we're seeing very uneven responses to the Common Core. I can, like Shael, go to schools. I see teachers planning together, critiquing each other's lessons, and I'm really encouraged by the thoughtfulness going into that work. At the same time, I'm seeing other schools where teachers are working in isolation, where there's no support, no feedback. I think the Doug Reedy's paper is something that should really call our attention to the patterns. If you're not getting kids to proficiency at reading by 3rd grade, the likelihood that these kids will graduate from high school college ready is very, very slim. Yeah. We know now that ending social promotion, see, this is, again, I want to be fair, and I'm sorry, sometimes I tend not to be as nuanced as I should be in my critique. But you know,
no fault, as you might be.
No faults.
But we claim to have ended social promotion in New York. Well, then how do we still end up with so many kids in high school at level 1? Right? Something clearly went wrong with this strategy. What went wrong is that we're not using assessment to diagnose learning needs. We're not getting teachers the information of what they need to do differently with kids, because another year at what you failed at is not an intervention, right? And so we've got to get better at that part of the work. Otherwise, we're not going to see a change in the patterns.
I think, because Pedro's point, I think, so Cynthia, did you want to?
Yeah.
Go.
No, I was just going to say, and you have to include parents in the whole curriculum training. They have to be at the forefront of that with everyone else, so they'll know, what to expect. Yes.
Yep.
I just want to take from Pedro because it elucidates the point that I was making. I think it's really important, as I look back on my experience in New York, because I'm another place in New York, understanding the structural dimensions, the school is the unit that matters, which is a fundamental motivating point. I would argue, Pedro, the distinguishing feature between those different schools that we're in are the schools. Right? We have to understand it. Now, there's an important role for to provide support, to provide resources, to channel and focus. But whether you're talking new schools or you're talking charter schools, right? We all know, and this is what we did successfully successfully, I think, in New York, is really focus on schools as the unit that matters in our school creation work, right? Charters nationally, not so successful. New York, successful. Same thing, new schools. That's because we understood that dynamic and how to build a school organization that was successful. And what I worry about is if that message isn't top of line, we will rebuild bureaucracy system structures that move leaders away from being leaders back into being administrators and paper pushers, and not sufficiently value the ways the structural strategy creates opportunities for teachers to work together and creates opportunities for students to learn.
Can I say something about innovation? Because Garth said something important. I'm worried.
I knew this would be a fun show.
I'm really worried that that we can easily get bogged down in the problems and not because one of the, I think, real bright spots of the Bloomberg years has been the creation of new schools. Right. For 3 years, I chaired the committee for CUNY that was authorizing the charter, charter schools. And what I saw was groups of educators very thoughtfully, when they had the time, proposing schools that are now highly successful. Yeah. That's a model for change that works for public schools as well. And we need to embrace that and make sure that continues.
And that was what, and it wasn't just me, let's be clear. That's what we did with the new school work. Exactly that. It was a way to mobilize the talent that existed in the district.
Yeah. I just wanted to pick up, I think the point Pedro was making about the differences in terms of instructional practice that we see across the system. One solution to that we've started to build over the past couple of years that I think is a good pointer for where we might want to go moving forward is the Middle School Quality Initiative. That started with about 20 schools and has now grown to 90 of our lower performing middle schools. And schools opt into that, but we push some schools to join it because it is a structured system of supports that does have like really smart, easy to use literacy diagnostic assessments that tell us which kids aren't decoding and need interventions around that, which kids are decoding fine, but either because of language development issues as English language learners or other reasons, their academic vocabulary is struggling and they need support around that. And we've built a curriculum for those schools that works across the grade. So not just the English teacher, but the social studies teacher and the science teacher and the math teacher are collaborating around the literacy skills that kids need. And then where kids are really struggling with things that are much lower level, like decoding, there's pull-out small group intervention support. And I think when you combine that with a team structure, because that's how you get teachers talking to each other. And so we reprogram those schools so that teachers share the same group of kids and have a common time where they meet together to talk about the academic progress of those students and to share strategies. You do get the kind of collaborative conversations. It's also the model that we taught new school leaders to build into many of the new schools, and that's why you see the instructional strength there. I think we can learn from that approach as a way, without doing a massive top-down direction on everything you have to do around instruction, taking research-based strategies, building them in targeted ways where schools need it, and really bringing the additional support to them in order to help them learn how to do it.
So we've spoken around the issue of accountability. We have the Chancellor with us. The state has implemented an accountability system around teachers and principals. It is one of the recommendations that continue, but to be modulated in certain ways. I'd like the panelists to react to the whole question, particularly of teacher accountability, but also principal accountability. What should the city be thinking about maintaining? What should it be thinking about changing to make the accountability system more effective?
Well, I'm happy to start on that. We put out a report this week that, if you haven't looked at it, I urge you to take a look at, because it's an attempt to look at what are the strengths and weaknesses of what we've done over the past several years on school accountability. And I think what we see is that the progress reports and the quality review are providing really important and valuable information and telling us a lot about schools, but there's also a lot of work we've done over the years to try and strike the right balance and address concerns that have been raised. And so, for example, the high school reports measure about 15 different data indicators and about a 50-50 balance between test scores and other indicators. The elementary and middle school reports, because there's less data, it's more like 80-20 or 85-15. And that can create, for some schools where there's weak leadership, or a misunderstanding of what the goal is, bad instructional decisions that can lead to things like too much test prep or narrowing the curriculum. So how do you strike that balance within the accountability system so that you're sending an instructional signal that values the deeper kinds of work and also values what we need to know about kids on the quantitative side? And I'll say that a key part of this is fixing the assessments. The state has done really important work over the past couple years to change the assessments to make them more aligned to the kinds of skills we really need kids to have. But these are at the beginning of what's needed. This is not done by any means, and there's a long way to go to get the assessments to the point where they're actually sending the right instructional signal to teachers and creating the space for them to do the work we need them doing. In the high school, for example, this paper recommends much more focus on reading and deeper kinds of research-based papers. The Regents recently passed a requirement for high school English that there be a research paper as part of the graduation. Oh, sorry.
You're hoping to
Propose it. I think that's a brilliant
wonderful
step
idea.
because it begins to signal to teachers it's okay to take time to go deep and spend 6 weeks on a research paper as part of your curriculum, and that's valued by the state. And we need more of those kinds of signals.
Yeah, I spent 6 months studying the canon law of Henry VIII's divorce. You may draw your own conclusions. Let me ask Ocynthia about parents' reaction to the school grades and to that kind of information. Do you want to share some thoughts
You
about
must have been reading my mind. Because I was thinking about like the school grades, the letter grades that that has been used for accountability. Parents look at, there's one school, a year, a school could get an A, right? And you think, wow, I want my kid to go to this school. And then another school may get a C. Well, no, that's not the school to go to. And if you go and look deep into the school, the C school may be doing a whole lot better than the A school. So I think people have to, going forward, the administration will have to really look at how they're really going to be holding these schools accountable and look at that whole letter grading system and really rethink that.
Okay, any last thoughts on this one?
Well, I would just say that this is one of the areas where I've come to appreciate the grading system. Not that I think Cynthia's point is still well taken, right? That is that there needs to be some, we need to keep fine tuning and make sure there's accurate information. Yeah. But what I've come to appreciate is the way principals respond to it. Mm-hmm. And the fact that very often they do start saying, okay, we need to work on these areas, yes. and that's helped. So I would hope, because I've heard, that the new mayor has said he wants to scrap it. We need to have some way of giving accurate information to principals and to parents about the state of the schools.
I think accountability is one of the hardest issues. It sits right at this balance of urgency and engagement. Right? I think it's one of the most important functions of it is what are we choosing to focus on as a group and how do we create collective urgency around it? Frankly, the progress reports, to Cynthia's point, they try and do a lot of things for a lot of different audiences, and that's really hard, right? Because it is the case that there are higher performing schools that score lowly, and I would sit here and tell you they should because they're not doing as much as they should with the kids, right? But that's an incredibly subtle point to try and make more broadly. I frankly think I agree with Pedro. It is important to maintain it, and I will tell you that we will all still be adjusting accountability for years and years to come, and I think we need to be okay with that. The last thing I'd say, and this was around the most important thing in accountability is when do you make the inflection from developmental support to consequential support, or consequential action, rather, whether you're talking about a teacher or you're talking about a school. And the reality is sometimes you need to make that shift, right? You need to make a decision to close a school. You need to make a decision to let go of a teacher. And those are always going to be incredibly difficult and incredibly controversial decisions, and no accountability system is going to create magic in that.
Just one other thing I would note as a really thoughtful recommendation in this report, and it's also contained in the report we released, is around the quality review. We have really invested deeply in trying to create a quality review that focuses on the instructional core, that asks the question, from the perspective of a senior educator in the system, going and looking at classes in the school, talking to parents, talking to kids, talking with the school leadership. is there really meaningful education happening, and are there systems to support that, and what can be improved? And those reports often get overlooked and don't get the attention that they deserve. And one of the things I think we would like to see happen in the coming years is allow more frequent opportunities to visit schools. Right now, schools are guaranteed a visit once every 4 years. Lower performing schools get it every year. I think schools should get it once every 2 years at least. And we'd like to expand the number of folks going on those visits so that it's more reliable over time. And I think building that kind of qualitative feedback into the accountability system and making it count in real ways is an important step that we've been looking at and want to move forward with.
Let me take a moderator's privilege, if I may, to address one issue that I didn't see really addressed in the report. And of course, it comes from my own work and that of my colleagues in teacher preparation. The City of New York has invested considerably through the Teaching Fellows Program, and for principals through the Leadership Academy. All the research suggests that when all is said and done, it's the quality of the teacher that matters most in the in-school impact on learning. What would you like to see? Would you like to see the ed schools in this city close down and essentially have the city train its own teachers? Would you want to encourage the kind of work that I've had the privilege of doing with Bob in the audience on New Vision's side of residency programs? Where would you like to see us help you get better teachers into your classrooms?
I mean, I don't think the ed schools need to close down, but I think that and I said this last year, and I still have a proposal pending with Merryl and John on this point. I do think that city has the capacity to be involved in teacher preparation more directly. We've done it through partnerships like the one you mentioned, the urban teacher residencies that New Visions has started with Hunter. The Internationals Network has a very powerful urban teacher residency program with Long Island University. And what those programs both do is they draw on the tremendous talents of school-based teacher leaders to become instructors for future teachers. And I think when you deeply integrate a teacher preparation program with the strengths of our stronger teachers in the system and make them not just mentor teachers, but also professors in that program, then you get a very different kind of program because teachers are actually getting prepared for the real work that's ahead of them. And there's a kind of reciprocal accountability that develops in those kinds of relationships because schools, as they're training those teachers, begin to develop a sense that there's actually a career pipeline, that part of the job of schools is to prepare new teachers coming up. And we're losing a tremendous amount of talent that we could be using by not having more of that happening in the city.
Let me speak to this, since I also work at a school of education at NYU. I would say that we have evidence showing our teachers, the ones we graduate, are actually well prepared. They're not well prepared to go into schools that are dysfunctional, into classrooms where they're expected to work with special ed kids who have no IEP and they have no training and work. So you need a real better partnership with the district about how we deploy new teachers, whether they be TFA or Relay or from TC or NYU. It makes no sense to me at all that we would take the least experienced teachers and put them into the most challenging classrooms. But this is what we've been doing under Teaching Fellows and all these other strategies. So to me, we need to both rethink teacher education to develop residency models, but we should be much more deliberately working to get teachers with a track record of effectiveness, not seniority, but track record of effectiveness into some of these high-need schools. That should be what we're after, not trying to blame schools of education for the fact that you put them in an impossible situation. We're doing the same thing to TFA. And that is really a fault of the system, I would say, not of the teacher education.
That's a financial investment, of course.
And I'd broaden the point. I think your point is right on, but the recommendations don't speak to teacher career trajectory, teacher development particularly, right? So I think Shael's earlier point about the shift in instruction on Common Core speaks to this as well. It's something that needs to start when folks are in preparation programs and continue throughout. I think we do need to think differently about what entry-level teachers do, but that means thinking differently about what senior teachers do as well, which is part of what Shael is speaking to. How do we retain those folks? I say all the time, why do we expect a teacher in their first year to have the same essential job as a teacher in their 15th? And yet that's the way we draw contracts. That's the sort of industrial way we think about the workforce. And I think it is important that we break that mental model.
And so I just want to add that I think that whether it's residency or whether it's teacher ed, I think that culture needs to be a part of the preparation, a part of the training, because you do bring new teachers and drop them into communities that are really struggling. They don't really know the community. They don't know what child they're going to be put in front of. And I think that is a huge part. They have to learn culture, they have to look at their own biases before they even go into a classroom, and they just have to be prepared on all those levels. And I think that when we were the community collaborative to improve District 9 schools, we brought in a program called the Lead Teacher Program, where it wasn't about how long a teacher had been teaching, but how effective they were, and paired those teachers together in a classroom. So we need to look at programs like that.
One quick point, the state has established these ladders, recognition of mentor teacher, leader teacher, but of course it depends on the contract that the next mayor and chancellor will be signing to put that into effect. I'd like to shift to some of the questions that have come from the audience. One of them speaks to the networks, which have been briefly referenced. What is the appropriate accountability system for a network? That's actually a very interesting question, which we haven't addressed.
So there is an accountability system for networks, and it's a combination of looking at the student learning for the schools in the network, the quality reviews for the schools in the network, the feedback from principals about the support they're getting from the network, and then we have a detailed rubric on what are the tasks that a network is responsible for, and we grade each network on whether they're meeting those obligations. And over the past several years, we've actually decided to close 8 of the networks, replace them with 6 new networks. Each year, principals also have the chance to vote themselves, in the sense that schools can change networks if they choose to, and approximately 90 to 95% each year stay put, but there are 5 to 10% each year that change. What we've learned about networks is that the same challenges around capacity exist at the network level that exist at the school level and at central. There's no magic here. You have to, and historically, when folks criticize the system for decades going back, one of the first places they go are the folks directly in the field supporting schools. And I think that there's a misunderstanding, and a deep one, about the ability for folks outside of schools to change what's happening inside of schools. It's definitely possible to provide meaningful support, and you definitely need higher quality support rather than low quality support. It makes a difference, but it also depends tremendously on how the school absorbs that help and how open they are to owning the changes that need to be made. And so understanding that tension between schools and those supporting them, whether it's a network structure or a district structure, is really important in order to get it right.
Well, I think it's a very mixed bag out there in the support. I mean, some of the very high-performing networks are really small, like the Urban Assembly, the Young Women's Leadership Schools, but when you start to look at these huge networks that have schools in all 5 boroughs, and where it's kind of drive-by, advising to a school, it raises question about the quality and the degree of support schools need. And that's where I think we got to look more closely. Is that structure working? I also think, and Shael alluded to this, that the relationship between the network provider and the schools is not a supervisorial relationship. If the principal doesn't like what they're hearing, they'll say, I'll join a new network, right? From somebody who will tell me what I want to hear or give me the support I think I need, and which presumes the principals know what they need. And in many cases, they don't. So I think the point about do they know how to receive feedback? Do they know what to do with it is, I think, an important one.
I mean, so I would. So I've spent 3 or 4 years now in New Haven, right? And we have a more typical command and control model. And I will tell you. So there are particulars around the network model and how it's structured. The shift from accountability to support from a central office is a foundational one. And I still cannot get my folks who the principals report to stop saying my school, my school, my school, right? No, it's a school you support. And I deeply agree with what Shael said earlier. We have to understand that school, as said earlier, schools are the units that change. It's very hard externally to force a change, and yet many folks who rise up make the assumption that that's what they're going to do. They're going to continue to operate as they have as a principal, and they may be telling folks, do this, do that, do the other thing, and across 10 schools, it doesn't happen. Now, I think Pedro's right. There needs to be, I think the great challenge, I think, from the New York sort of central office structure is what to do with the mid-performing schools, right? The schools that may not actually know, right? We need them to be successful, but they don't have the initiative or they don't have the skills themselves, and how to provide that support. I do think that's a challenge to the network model, and I frankly think that my sense is the district has worked on that in the years since I left.
There's a question here about literacy. We've seen research recently that suggests that even by 18 months old, children are at very different levels of vocabulary acquisition and hearing. There's a lot of speaking about pre-K programs, but the point made by the questioner is, doesn't this have to happen even earlier? And don't the figures in education have to speak to those in other domains of city government to really think about the birth to pre-K phase and how critical that is?
I think it would be great to create a 0 to 8 approach to education specifically focused on literacy and bring together providers that are working with kids at very young ages with the sort of new investments that are likely to be made in pre-K, and also strengthening early childhood in elementary schools. And I think that that kind of approach does depend on sort of a significant degree of coordination. And it's also a place where the philanthropic community could really step up and make some powerful investments.
I would just add, and this speaks to a point Ocynthia raised earlier about culture, that there's a real lack of awareness among many teachers in New York City of the cultural resources children are bringing in terms of literacy. We have, I think, a deficit mentality on the part of many educators that don't even recognize the language that children do bring and how that can be a resource for acquiring literacy. I want to refer people who are interested to a recent dissertation by Carolyn Strom at NYU, who did a study in the Bronx at a school looking at early literacy and the miscommunications between children and teachers who just simply were not able to understand the language that children are bringing and how that in fact could have been used. So yes, we need to, I could totally agree with the need to start early, but we also need to really invest in the kinds of strategies that make it possible for teachers to be much more responsive to what children bring so that we can strengthen and build those resources early, build confidence and build literacy at the same time.
I would just add that not just 0 to 8, but from when people are pregnant, women are pregnant, especially in the low-income communities, if there can be some kind of investment into helping them understand that, literacy starts now, where they can read to babies, in the womb.
Right. A very short, but I think pithy question, can each panelist define school choice? And I take it that underneath that pithy question lies a rather large iceberg.
It's exactly right. So school choice means any of a host of things. When people talk about portfolio schools, it means a host of things. As the first, I think, chief portfolio officer in the country, right? I'm acutely conscious of all the ways these terms have been abused and misused. School choice does not mean charter versus district to me. And so there's all personal definition, right? I don't think it means charter versus district. I think, at its core, it means recognizing it is an enrollment. There is an enrollment dimension to it, which is about the ability to choose. To speak for a moment about the zone recommendations, when I was at the department, we did look at the enrollment patterns in zone schools, And I think it's important to understand that district schools they're a little bit of I think there's a red herring. It's a fallacy, right? In high-performing neighborhoods where the zone can operate as a fence around the students that come, you get one kind of school. And in schools with more challenged populations, you actually don't have high percentages of students who live in that neighborhood, right? And many of the students who live in that neighborhood find ways to go other places. Now, to think that an enrollment pattern is going to change the underlying reality, which we all need to focus on, which is improving every school. So regardless of what the admissions procedure is, and that I think is the foundation, right? It's again, every school choice, and I think Chancellor Tisch said this, the only real choice is when every school is successful, right? And there isn't a district that is at that level. And we need to be okay with that challenge, not yell at each other about it, but figure out what do we do with those other schools in order to strengthen them.
I would add, I want to make reference to two other studies. One is a study by Norm Fruchter and the Annenberg Institute, Norm is here today, which looks at the large number of over-the-counter kids, right? These are the kids who are registering throughout the year. What schools do they go to? Yep. Now, they didn't participate in the choice process, but they're being channeled into these neighborhood schools, which are almost always the failing schools. And so you're setting up some schools. I think choice as it's been implemented in New York has produced winners and losers. Carolyn Satin is the other study I'd refer you to. She looks at how immigrant children navigate the choice process. Who do you think is, when they can't read the documents, it's children choosing. How are they choosing? They're choosing where their friends are going. So choice assumes easy access to information. Look at the binders that are produced. The binders produced they don't have the report cards in them. They have, every school is wonderful, right? How do you know which one? As a parent, going to my son's middle school and asking the counselor, how do I figure this out in Manhattan, which school I should choose? She said, there are only 10 to look at. I said, only 10 to look at? She said, just 10. These are the 10. I said, really? I said, does everyone know that? She says, no. I said, what's going to happen? I said, what happens to the others? She said, those are the losers.
Oh,
right?
wow.
Those are the losers. Now, maybe it's not 10, maybe it's 20. But God, that's a lot of losers, right, in a system.
I would agree with, if I could just build, I would agree with Pedro's point about the ways, choice presupposes an educational model. I think it actually goes to an innovation question, right? So one of the things we've looked at in New Haven is the exact same, is the over-the-counters of the students that arrive after October 1st. And yes, the way we've set up these systems, they tend to get concentrated in those schools that have the seats, and it becomes a bad cycle. But fundamentally, students arriving after October 1st, they challenge our conventional notion of what a classroom looks like and how we operate it. And so I think that's a particular area where the philanthropic community could frankly help think about innovation and innovative models and approaches to dealing with the reality of poverty that schools aren't set up to handle. They're set up to have students in September and have the kids through the course of the year, and that's not the way it works.
Just a couple small points. I think in response to some of the concerns that were raised on this specific issue over the counter, we actually have made changes to try and figure out how to deal with that. And so one of the changes we made is to begin to reserve seats that do not get distributed through the normal admissions process in every single school, so that there's a whole set of seats available for kids who come in over the counter, and they don't necessarily just end up having only open seats in the less popular schools. That's significantly shifted the pattern that was documented in that study, which is based on data that's now a few years old, and has given a fairer chance, I think, for kids that are coming in late. I think Pedro's right around the information sharing, and it's another thing that we've started to work on. We just did a competition with application developers, and there are now 6 enrollment apps that we published this year, which are very easy to use on your iPhone or whatever smartphone you're using to get a sense of the data, to get a sense of what's in the curriculum, what's in the attendance and teacher information. And it was developed through talking with groups of parents about what do they most want to know when they're choosing a school. And until you get to a point where all of the choices are good choices, there's always going to be a challenge with choice. And so how do you push on both fronts? How do you keep on pushing to create more good options? And again, we've created 650 new schools. Most of those are strong, good options. Not every single one, but the vast majority of them are. And that doesn't yet scratch the surface of the need. It accounts for probably about 1/3 of the seats at the secondary level. So there's still tremendous amount of work to be done, and it's slow work, because getting a school to be good is not something that you can snap your fingers and it just happens. When you build a new school, it's something that's built over several years, and when you transform an existing school and try and improve it, it's something that's done over several years.
Just very quickly, there was a research paper done by the Research Alliance quite recently, and it does indicate worryingly that the worse off the student by socioeconomic means, the more likely they are to under-choose in the sense of not thinking they can get into a school that is academically strong, and that, I think, is a concern. The question here is about the right balance of autonomy and accountability for principals. Have we got it right? Are there changes that the next administration ought to be looking at making? Clearly, that's a crucial part of the last 10 years, is that devolving of autonomy to the school site. Where are we in our thinking about that issue? Where are you in New Haven?
I would aspire to be much closer to where New York is, frankly, right? And I put my head down, so I'm less clear on the current state of these things. But the idea that the school, again, school is the unit that matters, that the school principal is not an administrator of directives that come from central office, but is instead a manager that needs and leader that needs to set their own vision and to build their own systems with support and other things. I mean, I do think, and I'm not clear on the current state. One thing that I was at least self-conscious of, I do think it's a strategy that works. And it's not just for the great principles, it works for the good principles. You know, it was very deliberately designed for that. But I think you have, a sort of middle core where, I'm not sure we provided enough direction and support, at least in the time that I was there. We hoped that the lodestar of accountability would point folks, and I don't think that was sufficient. But again, I would caution against shift, and I think the report underscores this. I would caution against moving away from the fundamental understanding that the school is the unit that matters, and that leadership needs autonomy, needs the ability to make decisions. Folks in central office, myself included, have a tendency to think you're right, and you know how to do things, and you know what's going to make a difference. And the structures need to push back against that very natural human instinct to tell people what to do.
Any other thoughts on this?
I disagree. I think that the way DOE was evolving it initially made more sense to me. That autonomy has to be earned, right? That is, that when you demonstrate that you actually know what you're doing, how to run your school, then you get to be autonomous. Yes. There are lots of other schools that need way more support. And it's interesting. I had a brand new principal. She just came out of the Leadership Academy, come to me, middle school principal. She says, I'm having food fights in my school. I don't know what to do. And my first question was, why are you coming to me? She said, because I'm afraid to go to my network or the DOE because I'm afraid I'll be evaluated. I just got here and I don't know what to do. So what did I do? I took her to another middle school a few blocks away, say, talk to her. They don't have food fights here. But that's what I mean. I mean, she needed help. She was afraid to get help because she was afraid the accountability would get her. Right? And this is not a realistic way to go about supporting schools. We need to be much more thoughtful and deliberate than we are. Autonomy sounds great in principle. Mm-hmm. In practice, it's untenable because you have too many schools overwhelmed by the situation. I'll give you one last. I had a principal at a school in the Bronx. Now, it's interesting. I always wonder, why do they come to me? Teacher said, we're about to have a riot at our school. Right? A riot. I said, a riot? I said, what's going on? She said, it's between Dominican students, those who just arrived and those who've been here. It's about to blow up tomorrow. What should we do? I said, again, why are you calling me? I said, but I could name groups in the community that they could call on to help them deal with and work out a truce. But that school, because it's so disconnected from its community, didn't even know what resources were available, even though they're besieged by this kind of problem. So I disagree that you can just tell the principals, run your school, and when they, in so many cases, they're so new to New York even, much less the neighborhoods they're in.
But actually, if I could respond, I mean, I think that Pedro's introduced an important third word, which is support, right? What Pedro's not doing is going in and saying, this is how you're going to handle the food fight, or this is how you're going to handle these issues. He's offering a level of support. And I think the core question is, where does support fall on the spectrum of from accountability and autonomy, right? And I think, you know, perhaps we didn't always get that balance right in New York, but I think the idea that so support, autonomy should not mean we're handing over the keys and, you know, good luck, right? And obviously that is how some folks have felt, and that's a problem. But what the core idea of autonomy is that this is your institution as the school principal, and we need to offer you support, but we're not going to tell you how to drive.
Yeah, I would just note there's something in the report that's really important around this issue that is a little bit of a separate point to the one you were both just discussing, which is the autonomy that's been created around hiring and budget. And I think historically, if you were a principal in New York City, you did not know who was going to show up on September 1st in your school. Teachers were legally provided the option of bumping into other schools when they were accessed from a school because there was a change in that school's budget. And so I remember this vividly as an assistant principal, having hired great teachers, worked with them all summer long, and suddenly 2 of them were gone on day 1 because they had been bumped by someone who knew nothing about our school but had chosen us off of a list. And that system is a really common system in most districts around the country, and it was changed. And so that control over hiring is critically important to maintain, and we need to be honest that that's very expensive. There's not a good solution yet, and it needs to be part of the contract negotiations coming up, because there are close to 1,000 teachers who cannot get hired by schools that are functioning as subs in an absent teacher reserve pool. Some of them are strong teachers, some of them are very, very weak. And we're paying their salaries. It costs close to $100 million. And in order not to force them into schools and bump teachers. Budget is a similar thing. It used to be that the district superintendent told you exactly what your budget was and what it was for, and you had no discretion. And you couldn't customize it and figure it out and decide, this is how I actually want to prioritize given the resources that my school has. And so I think in terms of those types of autonomies, we cannot go back. Now, in terms of the question of support, Parthenon, we asked Parthenon to look at the networks, and they did a really good report that came out a couple weeks ago that, again, I think is an honest assessment of where the strengths and weaknesses are, and they reflect some of the concerns that Pedro is raising, but there's real differences across the system. There are places where principals are going to fight fiercely if you try and take away the space and flexibility that they have. And they are not perfect principals, but they have made really good use of that autonomy. And then there are also places where, I think as Pedro notes, there are principals that are struggling and actually want direction. So the Middle School Quality Initiative is an example of that kind of direction around literacy and instruction and the instructional core. The targeted action plans for the lowest performing schools, where the network works with the principal to target the key instructional operational things. Those are both new things that have shifted in response to this criticism. And I think possibly there is a space to look at. One of Parthenon's recommendations was, what would it look like if you took the bottom 10 or 15% of schools and built a support systems specifically for them out of the superintendent's offices, where there was a much more directive management role in guiding the reforms that need to happen in that school, which is similar to the targeted action plans, but might come with more resources and more supervisory power in those contexts. And I think those kinds of ideas are worth looking at.
So I almost hesitate, given the rich substance of the conversation, to raise this question, but it did come from the audience. Somebody reminds me that we've had an election and that the new mayor has said certain things about education. And the question is, what worries you the most in the promises that he has made? If anything.
It's I mean, it may be easiest for me to comment since I will get back on the train. And I will confess to not following this. I mean, I worry about the oversimplifications, at least as I read it in the New York Times and in other sources, right? The idea that it's charter or not, the idea that it's choice or not. These are incredibly subtle and difficult issues. We need to get to a rhetoric around them that notes the successes, as we've said here, notes the successes, notes the distance we have to go, tries to engage in no-fault problem solving, but it does no good to sort of sort of cast aside the lessons of the charter sector, right, which frankly influence many of the good things that we're talking about here. Maybe not as systemically, not as far as it could, but I think that the lesson that I keep saying, the school is the unit that matters, that came out of the charter movement, right, and the charter work that we did in New York. And my hope is that as he sits and as he has groups like this of people of diverse opinions who are finding place to consult, he finds a way to walk back from some of what I think was the easy rhetoric. And this is the challenge of education. It's easy rhetoric to blame, to point fingers, to cut off. And I hope he finds a way to walk back from some of that. Please.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that in the current administration, the push was charter. I mean, it might not have been the intention, but the audience listened. That's what we heard. Charter school was the way. And I think that this is just like a reverse. Charter school is not the only way, and that attention has to be paid to the other 95% of the schools across the city.
Yeah, Pedro. So I would say what concerns me is what's not been said, right? That there's a whole lot about how to lead this system and build on successes of the last 12 years, but address the huge challenges. And I think one of the huge challenges is the issue of poverty and inequality in New York City, which has been a central issue in the campaign, and I think an issue that's been neglected in New York City in terms of our educational strategies. I think the mayor and the chancellor are going to have to be very thoughtful about how they approach that issue. And it hasn't been discussed, and so I'm left wondering
what it is.
What's the plan?
Okay. And Shael, I'm going to ask you what you applaud most in the new mayors.
No, I can answer the first question. Here's what I worry about. I think that what I've learned in this job is that it's incredibly delicate when you make a change for 1,800 schools, 100,000 educators, 1.1 million kids. You make a small change and it sends ripples like waves into schools, and you cannot predict exactly what the consequences will be. And so I think as we begin to look at changes, there has to be a sense of how do we make changes in very thoughtful and strategic ways that understand that in this moment, in this particular school year, we're going through one of the biggest changes the school system has ever seen. And it's not actually in the paper as much as it should be, but the introduction of the teacher evaluation system simultaneously with the introduction of the Common Core and new curriculum associated with it is a very, very intense learning experience and a lot of new work. And so as teachers and principals are grappling with that set of changes that have been triggered at the national and state level, and something that we embrace and we think is important, but all of that at once is a tremendous amount. And I think that there's a lot of worry and fear that some of the good elements of that won't be carried through because it'll be distracted by the new.
Can I just say also
Please.
one other thing, because the teacher's contract they are looming in the horizon.
Yes.
I think Merryl Tisch is absolutely correct. The investments that the city's made into the schools, how do you make sure there's resources to do expanded preschool, do extended ed? So there are going to be big budget issues as well that the mayor's going to have to figure out, and is going to need all you guys out there to continue to make strategic investments to support these initiatives.
So it's time for one last comment from each of the panelists on any aspect of our 1.1 million school children system that you would really want to bring to the attention of the next mayor, the next chancellor. Were you sitting next to her or him in terms of the chancellor? So let's ask you to think as much outside of the box as you wish. Bring us a thought that should be on the table.
I mean, I'll go first again as someone. I think. Part of it is it's good to be home, right? It's good to be back in New York. And, amidst all of the intensity of these discussions, I think this city needs to be proud of what it's done in education and embrace the challenges that are ahead of it. And I do worry at the stages like this that kind of vision, you can lose sight of it. I would say that. And I would go back to the point I noted at the beginning, and just to underscore it, I do think we talk a lot in education. I'm increasingly intrigued by the idea of how do we build student voice? And I think the best schools do that. But it's not systemically something that we focus on enough. And so how do we pair this academic orientation of the Common Core with the time and space to really build student agency in terms of their own education? And I think that will lead to an innovation agenda. And I think that if the city can find a way to really mobilize its students, even ahead of its parents. Sorry, Cynthia.
Yeah.
I think that will be. I think that will lead to powerful change.
Okay.
So, yeah. I guess if I was sitting next to both mayor and the chancellor, I would really ask them to really think about the restorative justice. That really means something to me, because our kids, they don't need to be trained that jail is your future. So I think that they really need to be thinking about programs, alternatives to punishment that will help the whole community.
Okay, Pedro.
I'm struggling to think of the one thing, but I guess that as the Bloomberg years come to an end, I do, like Garth, say New York's in a much better place than most cities around the country.
It is.
And that is a good place to start to think about the other areas where change is needed. And I think my hope is that this mayor will use mayoral control to bring other city departments in alignment with the DOE to tackle the more difficult, complex problems facing the communities that I think are struggling the most. And that's within the reach, but you're going to need to think differently about how to take a more integrated approach to tackle some of these issues. There should be social workers and counselors in all of our schools, particularly the high-need schools. And we should not expect schools to solve those problems by themselves.
I think one small suggestion and one larger one. The small one is we haven't talked a lot about the recommendations today in the report around college preparation and high school and the kinds of counseling and supports that transition kids to college effectively. One idea that we've been working on and have yet to sort of figure out exactly how to do, that I think would be a really smart move and send a powerful signal to kids, is every year kids don't apply to college because of the application fees. And it would cost the city roughly $500,000 to start covering the CUNY application fees for kids. And I think that would just be a powerful signal to kids about what our expectations are for them moving forward. More broadly, I think what this conversation shows and the conversations that are happening around the city right now is that there's a tremendous sense of excitement and possibility about what's next. And that brings a lot of goodwill, and it needs to be harnessed. And there needs to be a very public dialogue over the coming months that broadens the scope beyond this room and the rooms that it's been happening in, which are typically policymakers, into communities to try and figure out how do we take some of these great ideas and build on what we've got and actually make it into something that everyone has a joint investment in as we move forward.
Let me close with one thought, drawn partly from the many school visits I made as commissioner and also here in New York City. As I spend time in some of the most underprivileged classrooms, what strikes me most is the fact that students are bored, deeply bored, because they're not being challenged. And we are under-teaching our students across the state and across the country. It's partly on those of us who are doing teacher preparation, those who are working on implementing the curriculum, but we will not close the gap until we stop patronizing the less well-off. They are absolutely and of course equally capable of thinking deeply about curriculum, about substance, about the richness of content, and we have an enormous job to do because as we look at the differences of performance, it goes back to the quality of what we're sharing with our children. It remains for me to thank our panelists for a wonderful and rich discussion. And Fred, I think you're going to close us off with some remarks.
Well, David, I said to David when he came in I was going to hold him accountable. I have my report card here. I'm not going to give you a letter grade. But you did a fabulous job. I want to thank the panelists. I think we should thank them one more time. So we are at the end of this first phase. The papers have been completed. They've been disseminated. The panelists and you have weighed in. And I think we accomplished what we set out. We have triggered a deep conversation, which needs to continue. So over the next year, I think it's a safe assumption that the new administration, when it gets in place, will be looking for partners. And our sector may be asked to partner. So the question for us is how will we respond, both individually and collectively? So I would charge you to call us if you want to be further engaged in this project. I would ask you to write recommendations in terms of how you think we should be organized going forward. And when we get to the point where it makes sense, and after we've looked at what you have to say, hopefully we'll come together again and figure out what the next phase of this. So thank you, thank you, thank you.